Thank you. So let's start off. So I want to introduce myself first. My name is Brian Tibayan, and let's go back. Uh, I'm a PhD candidate in curriculum and instruction at the University of Idaho. Um, I am an international student. I am from the Philippines, where I spent most of my life, and I've been here in the US for about 6 years. And it's my last year of my PhD program, and I'm really, really excited that it's going to be done pretty soon. I'm on my data collection phase when I get to the fall, and hopefully by springtime, I'll see myself walking during commencement. So it's going to be an exciting time, and it's go time for me, actually. Um, my interests lie in applied theater and science communication. The reason for being because I do have degrees in broadcast communication and theater arts. My undergrad was in broadcast communication, and I worked in the radio and television industry for quite a while. I taught at the university in the Philippines, and then before moving on to doing my grad studies here in the US, I did a lot of work in content and creative development, did some IT stuff as far as the creative side is concerned, so the front end of it, and then did a little bit of stage and theater work and moved here to do my MFA in theater arts, and then eventually get into my PhD program in education. And so for starters, since I think in the blurb it says that we're going to do a little bit of improv activity. And how many people do we have on Zoom right now? Let me just check. Do we have a number?
Looks like 8 people.
All right, cool. That's great because it's more intimate that way. Now, with the challenge of doing improv on Zoom, because typically we do improv in person. And so we'll do a little bit of improvising the improv, as so to say. We'll do this improv. It's called Step Into the Circle. So, but before we engage in this improv activity, I want us to think about improvisation. And usually when you think about improv, it's the comedy sketches and whose line is it anyway, that show and all that. I don't want us to think of improv or improvisation as this big performative activity. What improvisation basically is, it's a spontaneous, intuitive response to the present moment. So as a participant or an improv participant, it requires us to be present in the moment, as we would like to say in theater. And just being open and aware and being spontaneous and flexible and adaptable to the change and being collaborative. So this improv activity, which is called Step Into the Circle, it's the participants will be asked to step into the circle as everyone is listening to the facilitator, which is me. And I will be reading I'll be saying a series of statements. And if you resonate with that statement, all you need to do is to step into the circle. But if it does not resonate with you, then you remain at the periphery or the perimeter of the circle. In this case, if you could raise your hand. I guess what we're going to try to do is we'll get out of the presentation for a while so that we can have the full grid and just see everybody on the grid. All right. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a while. Thank you so much for participating in that improv activity. That is just like one of the many things that I do and will be doing in the fall. I'll be teaching an improv class for scientists. It initially was just a workshop, and then the College of Education picked it up and they said, hey, let's just do a graduate course offering for this. And so we can offer it to science education students and more so everybody else. But my research is really into like the improved communication skills of STEM graduate students. And we can delve into that a little bit later because we are pressed for time. Okay, so for today, building trust Is communicating through empathy, through shared lived experiences? um, the model of communication, earlier model of communication, suggests that for communication to take place, the sender or the source, okay, the sender or the source needs to deliver that message while the receiver of the message interprets or decodes the message. Yes? However, that model of communication is rather lacking, as it does not take into account feedback to know if the message received was understood and how the message was understood, right? So the model is rather linear and archaic. Science is no stranger to that model. Get the information out there to the greatest number of people. And we know that communication is much more than just the sender, the message, and the receiver. Communication is complex and layered, as it is influenced by a myriad of factors that affects the way the message created, sent, and received. Factors such as a person's belief and value system, cultural upbringing, and even by way the person interacts with others and their surroundings that contribute to the whole communication process. Therefore, a person's lived experience becomes a crucial and determining factor, because a person's lived experience shapes how we interpret and convey information, influencing both the creation and the reception of the message. Now, to foster understanding, there must be trust. And as critical and thinking beings, we choose the people we listen to, we choose the people we follow. We choose the people we follow on X or Twitter, maybe out of trust, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe we find this person entertaining. But the basic tenet of it all is that there is that connection, and therefore there is some level of trust, right? Now, the question is, how do we build trust? I believe that it must come from a place of empathy. But why empathy? Empathy is the ability to understand and feel what another person is feeling. In other words, putting yourself in other person's shoes, right? But empathy is different from sympathy. Being sympathetic with someone means that you feel concern, pity, sorrow for someone without necessarily experiencing their emotions, as if maintaining a little bit of sort of emotional distance, right? For example, if a friend is grieving, you feel sorry for them, but you feel sorry for them and express your condolences, but you do not necessarily feel their grief, right? On the contrary, being empathic or empathetic would mean that you would feel their sorrow and pain as if it were your own. In essence, empathy is the capacity to understand and I can't read that. Okay. Capacity to understand and share the feelings of another, recognizing that there are complex interplays that are happening, both cognitive and affective. Cognitive empathy is perspective taking. And what that means is it's about intellectually grasping what someone else is going through. It's like putting yourself, again, like I said a while ago, is putting yourself in their shoes to see things from their perspective. So perspective taking. Another side of empathy is affective empathy, and it's about emotionally connecting with someone else's feelings as if they were your own. Right? Now, empathy in communication builds trust, it builds rapport, it's crucial for maintaining relationships. In clinical settings, there's a study that claims that higher physician empathy is linked to better patient outcomes. And that's why programs at Washington State University and the WWAMI program here at the University of Idaho and the University of Washington and all the other states that are involved in the WWAMI program have already placed clinical communication programs that are built on empathic communication, so that the medical students or the students who are being trained to become doctors would know how to interact with patients. And currently I am part of that program. Every now and then they would invite me over to act certain scenarios as the patient with Washington State University. It's a program called Clinical Communication Program with a veterinary college where I get to act as an owner of usually it's a dog or a cat. And sometimes scenarios like really, really hard scenarios like euthanasia. And sometimes I would get into character. And then just obviously, if you see your dog put down, that's going to conjure a lot of really sad feelings and you cry. And then it's up to the doctor or the student doctor to be able to interact and know what to do in times when the patient or say the patient is crying. And sometimes doctors or students don't know how to deal with that. So these things are very important so that you may be able to empathetically connect with that person, right? Empathy is also important in global and cross-cultural communications. It's also important in problem solving, decision making, encouraging open and creative dialogue so that people, individuals may be heard, right? In STEM, empathic communication is crucial for conveying complex scientific ideas to diverse audiences, extending beyond mere emotional resonance to include active listening and understanding. It's not just about just giving the information. Let me tell you an example. Many years ago, there was, I'm not so sure if you remember the cyclone or the hurricane called Haiyan, and this was probably in 2013, but it hit the Philippines really, really bad. And it cost a lot of lives. It decimated like towns and villages in about 8 minutes, 6,000, almost 7,000 lives, according to the government, the Philippine government. They claimed that it was 7,000, and then there were 1,000 people missing at the time. And this was close to me because my mother comes from this part of the region of the Philippines, in the eastern part of the Philippines. Fortunately, my mom was in Manila at the time as well. But one thing that the National Weather Bureau said at that time was this cyclone is so strong that it is going to cause a storm surge. And at that time, and I even didn't know what a storm surge was, but they did say that it was going to be 23 feet high, right? But there was no cultural reference to it. At that time, we knew what a tidal wave was, obviously, from many movies and, and conversations and what we've seen on television. We know what a tsunami is, with what happened to Japan and Thailand, but we never knew what a storm surge is, and the gravity that it will do to the community. And so there were people who did evacuate, and there were some who just stayed in their villages. And fortunately, it did cost a lot of lives lost because people didn't know what storm surge is. And so that was saying, so you put out the information out there without having some cultural reference to it because people didn't know what it is and didn't know what the gravity of the situation was. So I feel like at some point there has to be some form of empathic narrative that should have been put out there so that people can understand what the situation was at the time. Just trying to be conscious of the time. We've got about 30 minutes left. All right. And so my relationship with empathy over the years has been inspired by a diverse set of experiences. And while research on empathy has been mostly Western oriented, there seems to be no direct translation of empathy in the Philippine setting. But it doesn't mean that the Filipino culture does not have a culture or manifest a culture of empathy. In fact, the empathy seems to be more of a collective construct rather than how Western cultures tend to emphasize individualism. Thus, we have Filipino terms such as bayanihan, pakikiramay, pakikipagkapwa-tao, pakikisama. And very interestingly, and I say this because empathy seems to be a collective construct, because it's more of community building. It's more of like, I am here because we are, right? Bayanihan is very interesting because it's a, as it says, it's a spirit of communal unity and cooperation where community members come together to help one another without expecting anything in return. To put it more blatantly, neighbors would come together to help one another, and it's often seen in the practice of carrying the entire house to a new location, right? It involves a group of, and we're not talking about really concrete houses, like houses that are made of bamboo and leaves. Back during the day, nobody does that anymore. It's probably in the 1800s, and I think my mom, who's already 80 years old right now, she saw that when she was young, she was young in the 1940s. There were still people doing the bayanihan spirit, where people just lift the whole house and move to another location without asking for anything in return, because that's the way it is. And that's empathy at work, right? Pakikiramay is more of like a sad story. When somebody dies, you go to their wake. That's pakikiramay. Pakikipagkapwa-tao is what I'm saying. I am because we are. So that empathy is deeply embedded within the community. It's sort of like community building. Now, I do like the sense of empathy, because coming to America, I realized that empathy can be a powerful tool for cultural responsiveness, and it's a way to deeply respect, acknowledge, and understand diversity at its very core. That no matter how different we all are, we all long for the same things: to be seen and heard. And as a person of color, I live that. I live in that space every day. I'm aware of it. I'm reminded of it. I struggle with it. I strive, but I also celebrate the wins. And as researchers and scientists, we need empathy to reach more diverse audiences, to effectively engage with people from different cultural backgrounds and perspectives. Empathy in communication promotes inclusivity and therefore fosters trust. So in my life, I've been a radio announcer. I've been a theater actor, so you can see it for yourself. This one picture. This was a radio station in Illinois. And I was more of like an operations manager, but the announcer at that time, it was the elections back in 2020, I think, yeah. And everybody was out on the field doing their reporting, and so I had to step in to do the announcing. But back in the Philippines, I was an announcer for about 8 years. And I'd just like to share with you, with a little time that we have left. God, Jackie, you weren't really kidding when you say that this is gonna go by really, really so freaking fast.
Absolutely.
So I'm really going at a hyper speed here. I'd like to share with you what I learned about working in radio for about 8 years or so back in the Philippines. And as announcers, you would be hosting shows, events, interviewing guests, interacting with callers, multiple roles that requires some degree of empathy. Active listening. You have to pay close attention to your guests' explanations. And if at some point in time you become a radio host yourself, hosting a science show, a physics show, or just being interviewed as a guest in a show, active listening. You have to pay close attention. There has to be emotional resonance, right? Understanding the guests, where they're coming from, creating a comfortable atmosphere, fostering genuine connections on and off air. Emotional resonance is as important as the actual words that you will say. Without emotional connection, the life of a radio announcer, or maybe the life of a science communicator, wouldn't be as fun and productive. In fact, the lack of empathic connection leads to decreased engagement, and this is so true for radio. Loss of trust, reduced loyalty or reduced listenership, limited audience growth and support, and missed opportunity for impact. Definitely bad for business if one of these, if it checks out. Definitely bad for business, bad for job security. But it's a good thing that I lasted for 8 years in radio. No one wants to listen to a host that's detached, uninterested, or robotic. So now, acting on stage. How do you perform with empathy on stage? Not just acting, maybe presenting also. I work with a lot of graduate students who join the 3-minute thesis competition, if you guys are familiar with that. Graduate students from the STEM fields or whoever is doing their research get to promote, to showcase their research in just 3 minutes. And the one thing that I noticed about presenters, that there is a stark difference between graduate students from the STEM fields who present their research as opposed to research from the arts and humanities. With science graduate students, they put in as much information as they want to in about 3 minutes. And 3 minutes is not a lot, much so that my hour here is almost coming to a close. So 1 hour isn't a lot, but let alone 3 minutes. It's so hard to put all of the work that you've done for like 5 or 6 years and put it in just this, little teeny tiny time of 3 minutes. And even some of the professors would even encourage their students to put more data, research, the methodology. That's not going to work because you only have 3 minutes. And because you're talking to people who don't know anything about what you do, the understanding is going to be limited. So what I urge those who would participate in the 3-minute thesis competition is we have to know the significance of your research and why it is so important to me as a layperson, right? Obviously, you'll explain what your research is, what you've done so far, and if you already have an outcome or results, then you will obviously present that, but make it known why you started your research in the first place and why you think is it important to the world. I think that's what is more important. And if by some stroke of luck they become interested in you, in your research, they'll come to you and ask more about it, right? And
I
so,
just want to, oh, so can I make a comment or kind of
yeah,
interaction here?
go ahead, please. Yeah.
When you were mentioning about like why you got involved with your research, including that in the, 3-minute thesis, I think that's very powerful. And I think, at least from my experience, we are very often ready to talk about, as you say, kind of all the data or methodology or whatever else, even like what it could be used for. But maybe it is just as important to think about like, why did you even start doing this in the first place? What does that story look like? Maybe it's not a long story for people, but I think it can probably draw it a lot out. So I just wanted to
No,
comment on
totally.
that.
I mean, the methodology section or what have you, you have the journals for that. But people need to know what it is that is, why you're doing, why is it important, and who are you doing it for, right? So as far as like, how do I relate my theater experience or performing on stage with science communication is, I'd like to say a few things. Authenticity. People will know if you don't know what you're talking about. People will know if you're just winging it. Although I say that to myself all the time, like I just got to get through, right? But people will know if you're just faking it too, and people will know if you are, just sorry for the term, but BS. It's all a bunch of crap. People will know if you're being truthful, but people also appreciate if you're being vulnerable. What does that mean? People appreciate the challenges involved in the research. People appreciate what you had to go through, or any sort of feeling that you're feeling at the moment. Like a while ago, like an hour ago, I was like talking to Jackie, like, oh my God, Jackie, I'm feeling a lot of big feelings right now. And as at that time, I was just really being vulnerable. But that's also acknowledging yourself, right? And knowing that you don't have the answers to everything. And connection with others is so important when you're on stage. Like I said a while ago, if you're a radio announcer, people don't like to listen to, if you're robotic, if you're unattached, right? So the lack of empathy on stage, at least, or if you're presenting, will bring about doubt, bring about confusion, and bring about uncertainty. And we don't want that, especially in something that's exact as science. And we want people to understand more, right? So I mentioned this a while ago, empathy in research and academia. For me, in my 5 years working as part of the 3MT organizing committee, I've learned that presenters have taken the time to distill their research in a way that will be understood by the public do win. And those that don't, that's the way it is. And they understand the task that they are not afraid to go the extra mile to engage their audience through storytelling and just presenting information as they were in, not like just you're presenting an information in academic conference, because that's a total different ballgame. Like you have your peers, right? You have your peers, people you talk to, people admire. So somehow people do understand the jargon. But if you're talking to the public, they don't understand the jargon. Chances are you're probably the only expert in the room. So in the fall, like I said a while ago, I have this class to present. I'll be conducting this class. Hopefully it's going to be a success. Wish me luck. And it's all about the 3-minute thesis presentation. And this is the group of people that I worked with last year. Shout out to the University of Idaho. We sweep the whole state competition. And they were my first batch of trainees in the 3-minute thesis competition. So good job to everyone who participated in that. And so for the last few minutes, I'd just like to really talk to you about the lessons I've learned in the 3-minute thesis competition so far. When you present in public, make sure to simplify research by distilling complex ideas into clear, concise messages. What does this mean? Number one, avoid jargon. Avoid jargon at all costs. If you must use technical jargon, like some very fancy nuclear scientific jargon, like what probably Robert knows more than I do, make sure to clearly explain complex concepts and terminologies clearly first before moving on to the next part of your presentation. And you can utilize repetition here. Once you've introduced a terminology, utilize repetition as much as you can so that people can remember that term. Number two, develop empathic, impactful narratives. So what this means is you have to create engaging stories that highlight the significance and human impact of your research. Start with your presentations with relatable stories or personal anecdotes related to your work to capture interest and foster emotional connections with the audience. I don't know if it was you, Jackie, but there was a seminar that we attended for our science talk, and this person related pepperoni on pizza. Was that you? No, okay. I think I mentioned this. I thought it was you, but I think she related pepperoni and pizza, the craters on the moon, right? So that was as an interesting analogy, and it got my attention really quick. And also sharing your personal journey behind the research helps too, including the challenges, the triumphs, does help humanize science a lot. Because sometimes people think that this science thing is some far-fetched, reachable concept, that it's so hard and intimidating to fathom. But if we try to explain it in their own language, in their own cultural experiences, it gets easier to understand, right? Using storytelling techniques help too. There's so many of them. Storytelling is a powerful tool in presentations, creating emotional connection. What are these techniques? You can start with a hook to grab your audience's attention right away. You can start with a surprising fact. You can start with a compelling question. You can start with improv, if that caught your attention. And you can start with an intriguing scenario. You can have to also consider building a narrative arc. Back when we were in high school and in grade school, our teachers would always say there has to be a beginning, middle, and end. When you write your story, there has to be a beginning, middle, and end. And there's a very interesting a way of writing stories considering the ABT. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the ABT, the and, but, and therefore. If you write your stories with just and, there is no dynamics to the story. But if you have an and, but, some research says that, then refutes your research, and then you try to reinforce your research by another and, but therefore. So there's a structure that is so easy to follow, but it makes sense. Don't be afraid to incorporate emotion. It's okay to engage emotionally. And begin strong and end strong. Storytelling techniques. Be mindful of nonverbal communication. Your body language, your facial expressions, your vocal tone, the use of pauses. I cannot emphasize that enough. Sometimes when we want to get information out there, left and right, we need those pauses. In acting, you don't just spew the lines here and there. You have to have pauses in between. And those pauses are not for you, mind you. Those are not for you as the presenter. They're for your audience, because it allows your audience to comprehend what you've just said in the last minute or so, and gives them time to think and then anticipate the next lines that you're going to say. Love your pauses. Practice makes better. And when I say practice, by all means, please do practice. Sometimes I did kind of practice last night, and just getting things in perspective. But then I got so paranoid that I just had to stop at some point. But engage in mock presentations with colleagues and reflect on their feedback. But I think also, more importantly, other than practicing in front of the mirror and all that, but I think you also have to explain your research in front of non-experts, such as family and friends. Like the research that you're doing right now, how will your 80-year-old grandmother understand it? Maybe your grandmother's an expert, but chances are maybe they're not. Then how can we distill that message so that people can understand it better? So I encourage everyone to just listen to their feedback, the non-experts, family who's not an expert in your field or not in your same field as you are, or friends. Listen to their feedback and reflect on how you can better develop your presentation. You want a presentation that is accessible to people who don't know much about your work. And there is no other way to get over the nerves, because I always do get the nerves. In fact, the whole morning I was pretty anxious about what's going to happen. And there are a lot of there are a lot of techniques to be able to, mitigate the nervousness and all the anxiety, and just to build your confidence, breathing exercise and all that. But nothing beats practicing to build the confidence. This is what I do. If you're going to present in an event, arrive at your event a few hours before your actual speaking engagement. Familiarize yourself with the room and the space, get comfortable, and rehearse if you're able. But nothing beats practice. That's why I say practice makes better. Not necessarily perfect. Sometimes perfect is boring, right? So you just got to get better. And lastly, and we got like 4 minutes on time, practice humility, inclusivity, and celebrate meaning making with others. And that's very important. I think that's the most important of all, is to just practice all these things, because I think, and I always have to check in on myself all the time. We talked about privilege. I feel like the more that we're knowledgeable, the more that we're privileged. And sometimes the higher that we go up that echelon of knowledge, we become more privileged. And so there is a certain sense of, I would say, arrogance, because we know more. And I have to check myself always, because I don't own the knowledge. Nobody does. You don't have absolute ownership to knowledge, because a lot of disciplines will contribute to your knowledge that you may not necessarily know about if you did not collaborate or just didn't listen to what they were saying, right? It's acknowledging that you do not know all the knowledge. Once it's out there, I know, like as researchers, as scientists, we feel very, very attached to our work. But once it's out there, it's not yours anymore. Obviously, you had to do a lot to be able to produce that kind of knowledge or the results. But once it's out there, it's not for you to interpret, or it's not for you to decode. It's for your audience, and the audience will go into all sorts of, like, thinking about, like, how is this useful to me? How is this beneficial? How is this relevant to me? Right? So it's not yours, but it's also your responsibility to be a civic scientist, so to speak, to be able to distill your message. It's not dumbing down. I keep on hearing this term a lot. It's dumbing down the message. It's not. It's actually hard to be able to translate your very technical research into something that's palpable and accessible, right? So, so just incorporate culturally relevant examples and address this audience's specific concerns to foster a deeper connection with them. And with that, you'll find a much better connection with you as a scientist and your public. And so with that, that's my presentation for the coffee hour. Thank you so much.